So this is just a very short lecture addressing Thomas's four kinds of law. This is covered on page 184 through 187 in Nash. I'm going to cover a little bit of what Nash addresses and then get into natural law more specifically. If you have an interest in natural law, as far as something that's easily accessible, I would really recommend reading The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis and looking at his appendix in the back where he talks about the Tao. Tao is spelled T-A-O. The Tao is, he's there citing from all different moral codes throughout the world, even Native American, all different religions, and showing how basically their ethical principles are much the same. So that's an easily accessed little intro to the natural law. I'll give you some information on the natural law here. So this is Aquinas and his focus on the law, and you should know today in the field of natural law, Aquinas is especially cited, and there are three Roman Catholic philosophers, Germain Grisez, John Finnis, who's also a legal philosopher, and Joseph Boyle. And they are really strong proponents in the world of philosophy and of legal philosophy of the form of natural law that Aquinas puts forward. I'm what's called in the world of philosophy, me, your professor, is called a natural lawyer. It doesn't mean I have a JD, a Juris Doctorate behind my name, but a natural lawyer is an ethicist whose greatest focus is on the natural law. However, my focus on the natural law is not Roman Catholic natural law like theirs. You'll see that natural law is very broad as far as the different proponents of it. So, excuse me, Nash gives us this little diagram showing the relationships amongst eternal, natural, human, and divine law. There's a big circle up above and a small circle down below. The big circle up above, eternal law, is the law of God that applies to all of the creation. Think of it even like the angelic beings. The eternal law includes both moral laws and the physical laws that govern all nature. Eternal law is God's mind conceiving and determining everything that exists. Every other form of law flows out of the eternal law. That bottom circle, the small one that says positive law is technical lingo to speak about law created by human beings. The most famous 20th century philosopher to deal with positive law is H.L.A. Hart and his book, The Concept of Law. He taught at Oxford University, and he taught all the great legal philosophers, the best legal minds of the 20th century, many of whom have lived into the 21st century. And so Dworkin would be Dworkin, is probably the best known American legal philosopher who was taught by Hart. But positive law is just human law, laws that human beings have come up, what they have come up with. Natural law is the part of eternal law that applies exclusively to us, and the idea is that it's written on our hearts, per Romans chapter 2. It's a law that you can't help but know. And if there's a contemporary author or writer who especially addresses this, it's the Roman Catholic legal philosopher down in Texas, Bujajewski, J. Bujajewski, and he has a book called Written on the Heart. It's really quite excellent. He also has a book about not losing your faith when you go away to college that's great for Christian young people. And so he deals very practically with the natural law. We're going to, as I said, we're going to get into it. Divine law is it's God's eternal law communicated to human beings through special revelation, through his word. So in Romans, Paul poses a question in chapter 3 about Jews. He's talking about Jews and Gentiles both being sinners alike, and he says, so then what's the benefit of being a Jew? And he says, great in every respect, for to them was entrusted the oracles of God, and especially that means the law. So it's God's eternal law communicated to humans through special revelation. It's the revelation of God's moral law through the Bible. And so this is Nash. He says, while Aquinas suggests that natural law is for unbelievers and God's divine law is for believers, that's too simple. Life is full of circumstances when believers, for one reason or another, can be aided by their knowledge of the natural law, that's really true, and when unbelievers can be instructed in the content of revealed morality. And an awful lot of unbelievers are very much familiar with the Ten Commandments, for instance. So eternal law applies to everything that God has made. Positive law has to do with the laws that human beings make, and it can't help but have a little bit of overlap with eternal law. And then natural law and divine law are kind of two sides of the same coin, or of a different coin, I guess. Now, the divine law is that which is given by special revelation to human beings. Natural law is that which God has kind of imprinted on us. So this is Nash 184 through 187. But natural law ethical reasoning, I want to introduce you to the what's called the locus classicus. The locus classicus means the first place in history where we encounter a concept. For instance, the first place in the Bible, in Genesis, that you encounter the concept of integrity, and it sets the tone for what integrity is all about for the rest of the Bible, is when God appears to King Abimelech, who has yanked Sarah, Abraham's wife, into his harem, and he's intending to have relations with her. God tells him he's a dead man, and Abimelech says, "But Lord, you know I did this in the integrity of my heart." And the way that integrity is used there, the first time the word is used in the Bible, then sets the meaning of it for the rest of the Word of God. So this is the place in human history. This is in Sophocles, and Sophocles has written this book or this play called the Antigone. It deals with two sons of Oedipus who fight with one another and kill each other. Polynices and Eteocles kill each other. And Eteocles, excuse me, is on the side of his uncle, who is King Creon. And so, since he's on Creon's side, and Creon is the beneficiary of their killing each other, he then wants to shame his deceased nephew Polynices. So he will not allow his body to be buried. That's the way that he's shaming him. And so Polynices' sister, her name is Antigone, and she comes along and she finds her brother's body, and she takes it and she buries it, although the king had decreed that nobody was to bury it. It was just to be left there to decay, let the bugs and the birds and the dogs eat it. And so she was not going to let that happen to her brother's body. So what he does is, once the body has been buried, they take hounds and they go and they find the body, and they dig the body up again and put it right back where it was again, and then he sets a guard. And Antigone comes once again to bury the body of her brother, and doesn't want him to be shamed and humiliated. So now she's been brought before her uncle, and he's quite a tyrant. And he says to her, "Now tell me thou, not in many words but briefly, make this short, knewest thou that an edict had forbidden this?" Did you know that I said that his body was not to be buried? She says, "I knew it. Could I help it? It was public." And he said, "And thou didst indeed dare to transgress that law? I'm the king. How dare you do what I say not to do?" And she's not being smart-faced, but she's answering back. She's saying, everybody knows that the right thing to do is to bury a person. You don't dishonor them like this. And she's saying, you don't have the authority. You don't have the authority to say something like that and to enforce it, because you're not one of the gods. So she says, "Yes, for it was not Zeus that had published me that edict. Not such are the laws set among men by the justice who dwells with the gods below, nor deemed I that thy decrees were of such force that a mortal," meaning you, my uncle, "could override the unwritten and unfailing statutes of heaven. For their life is not of today or yesterday, but from all time, and no man knows when they were first put forth." So she's saying everybody knows this law on the inside, that you don't do something like this. You may remember that Achilles wanted to do this to Hector, and his father has to go and beg for his son's body from Achilles so that he can bury it. And so this is a way of absolutely humiliating somebody after they had died, to dishonor their body. And she's saying, "This is just wrong, uncle. It's wrong, and you don't have the right to do this." Now what he does is he locks her away in a cave, and she's supposed to die there, and she hangs herself there. Sadly, his son, who is in love with his cousin, wanted to marry her, and he goes there, but it's too late, and she's deceased. So it's a tragedy, clearly. The story is a tragedy. But this is the first place in literature that we encounter the idea of natural law. So this is the locus classicus. So the next bit here is from Aristotle. So Aristotle says, "By the two kinds of law, I mean particular law and universal law. Particular law is that which each community lays down and applies to its own members. This is partly written and partly unwritten." So this is what was positive law in that diagram that Nash gave us at the beginning. Universal law, he says, is the law of nature. This is natural law. For there really is, as everyone to some extent, and the word is divines here, it means perceives, there really is, as everyone to some extent divines, a natural justice and injustice that is binding on all men, meaning all people, even on those who have no association or covenant with each other. Everybody knows this law on the inside. You can't help but know it. It is this that Sophocles, Antigone, the niece of Sophocles, clearly means when she says that the burial of her brother, this is Polynices, was a just act in spite of her uncle's prohibition. She means that it was just by nature. And then he quotes from the play, not of today or yesterday it is, but lives eternal, none can date its birth. So we see that this concept has ground, it has traction, it has that it's perceived by Aristotle and by others before Aristotle as this real idea that there's a law written on human hearts. So now this is Seneca writing later, about another little bit more than another century later. There is a true law, a right reason conformable to nature, universal, unchangeable, eternal, whose commands urge us to duty and whose prohibitions restrain us from evil. Whether it enjoins or forbids, the good respect its injunctions and the wicked treat them with indifference. This law cannot be contradicted by any other law, and it is not liable to derogation or abrogation. So you can't add to it or take away from it, is the idea. Neither the Senate nor the people can give us any dispensation for not obeying this universal law of justice. It needs no other expositor and interpreter than our own conscience. It's not one thing at Rome and another at Athens, one thing today and another tomorrow, but in all times and nations this universal law must forever reign, eternal and imperishable. Isn't that interesting? That these are not Christians, they're not Jews, but they're saying we have the law that we know on the inside deeply. And here's Paul. He says, for when Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these not having the law are a law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them. On the day when, according to my gospel, God will judge the secrets of men through Christ Jesus. So this next slide is from Dr. King in his letter from a Birmingham jail. And he famously says, one may well ask, he's writing it's a letter that he writes secretly while he's in the Birmingham jail. He writes it on the margins of a newspaper, and he writes it on toilet paper and all that sort of thing. And then it's sneaked out and it's put in the newspaper. And it's a letter to his fellow clergymen because some of the white clergymen are criticizing the African American folks for protesting the way that they're being treated. And he's telling them that I'm not a scofflaw, I'm not somebody who disrespects the law, but you're forgetting that there's a law above the law. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? Writes Dr. King. The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. And so when Augustine says that, he's saying that in light of the natural law. Although natural, this is me in my dissertation. So there's a few quotes from my dissertation here, my PhD. Although natural law thought has waxed and waned in its popularity with moral and legal philosophers across human history, and although it seems at times to have been relegated to the philosophical scrap heap, it eventually always resurfaces. Philip Devine has put it this way: the natural law tradition, though frequently debunked, reappears whenever the dangers of moral chaos become evident to all observers. So why does he write that, and why do I say this? Well, when we're dealing more and more with the skeptical anti-faith thought process of modernism, such as what we encounter in the Enlightenment and the centuries after the Enlightenment comes into being, the modern era, we have there being a mocking, a disregard. I told you that Aristotle had been relegated to the scrap heap, and then the young lady, I never named her in my lecture, but Elizabeth Anscombe is the one who rehabilitates Aristotle and brings him back out. And now in the world of philosophy, his thought in the field of ethics is the most influential of all. Well, also, the thought of natural law had been come to be disregarded. It was the basis of our law from the Roman Empire right down till the 18th century. When you speak about Blackstone's book of English law, it's all about natural law undergirding the positive law that human beings have created. And so it has been now kind of thrown away because we don't believe that there's some law that God has given us that transcends all other law. But what happens is, in the wake of the horrors of the Third Reich and of the final solution and what's perpetrated upon the Jews and the Romanians, the Gypsies, the mentally handicapped, the gay and the lesbian people of their time, as they're all slaughtered in these concentration camps, then there's a bringing back out of natural law. And there's a use of the natural law against the war criminals of the Third Reich. So one example of the natural law being brought back out into the public arena in the modern world is when the International Military Tribunal at the Nuremberg trials found the lawyers for the Nazis claiming that their clients were being tried by ex post facto laws. They're saying, wait, you can't try us by these laws. These are not the laws of the Weimar Republic. They're not the laws of the Third Reich. You're trying to say that what we did was illegal, but we were obeying the laws of our own country. And so Robert H. Jackson, he's the chief counsel for the United States, and he's the one who's the prosecutor. And he says this, in interpreting the charter of this gathering together of the nations who are addressing these war criminals, we should not overlook the unique and emergent character of this body as an international military tribunal. It is not bound by the procedural and substantive refinements of our respective judicial or constitutional systems. In other words, whatever you say the law was in the Third Reich, we're not bound by that, nor will its rulings introduce precedents into any country's internal system of civil justice. We're not imposing our law on you. But he goes on to say, as an international military tribunal, it rises above the provincial and transient and seeks guidance not only from international law, but also from the basic principles of jurisprudence, which are assumptions of civilization and which long have found embodiment in the codes of all nations. So he responds to the claim that the war criminals are being tried after the fact by laws that didn't apply or didn't obtain. That's using that word obtain the way that Dr. Nash defines it. Later, he's going to address it when we deal with possible world's thought. By laws that didn't obtain in their country, or they weren't the laws that prevailed in their country and in their time, by saying that the tribunal was dealing with laws that were transnational and transcultural. So Jackson is citing natural law. This is an example of natural law referenced in the secular arena without any allusion to religious or metaphysical concepts. The secular versions of this kind of thought are to be found in the pre-Socratics, before Socrates, the Athenian school. So that means Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The Hellenistic philosophers, especially the Stoics, like Seneca, who I cited. The legal philosophers of imperial Rome, and that's as we have the church rising in imperial Rome, and various modern philosophers since the 17th century. Spiritual expressions of natural law are traceable to the ancient Hebrews and early Christians. This is still my dissertation. To the scholastics, so that means people like Thomas Aquinas, but others as well, Duns Scotus and others of that time, of the high medieval period, to Roman Catholic philosophy, down to the present day. I mentioned to you Grisez, Boyle, and Finnis. And recently to numerous Protestant philosophers as well. So natural law is now making a real rise, especially in Reformed theological circles amongst Protestants. Natural law is also arguably found in non-theistic Eastern forms of spirituality that espouse concepts like the Tao and the Dharma. And so I'm citing those, the Burke and Holmes and Parender, but because I first heard about that and realized that in reading Lewis in The Abolition of Man. These differing forms of natural law thought place the locus of the law in various spheres. It's in different places that they anchor it. But all of them hold that there is a law which is not a mere product of human decisions, cultures, or conventions, and which has isness to it. It has real substance. And we can't just ignore it or think of it as being something that human beings have dreamed up. So Aquinas says there's two legitimate sources of morality: reason and faith. And so that's a part of what, as we approach the issue of law, Reason is something that gives us content to the law when we speak about natural law, and then faith when we speak about God's revealed word as far as his commands. No less a religious skeptic than psychologist and historian of science Michael Shermer is comfortable employing a secular and scientific form of natural law or natural law-like reasoning. And it should be said, since this time, Sam Harris, who's one of what they call the four horsemen of the new atheism, has written a book that also uses natural law reasoning to speak about what's right and wrong or moral. Also, Larry Arnhart. Arnhart argues the tradition of ethical naturalism, it's just a synonym for natural law, from Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas to Alasdair MacIntyre, can be supported by a Darwinian account of ethics, so meaning an evolutionary account of ethics, as rooted in human biological nature, which combines liberty, order, freedom, and virtue. So isn't this interesting? Everybody acknowledges that there's this law above the law. Thus, natural law holds the potential of providing us with a coalition ethic. An ethic that's an umbrella over all other ethical systems, that bridges the gap between believers and unbelievers in ethics. So that's me telling you about natural law. Now this is Nash summing up, because this is the end of the chapter on Aquinas. So Nash says, there are three of his accomplishments especially worthy of note. First, he provided wisdom and inspiration to numerous philosophers, theologians, and representatives of other disciplines who applied what they learned from him to the new problems and challenges of their own time. He's kind of always relevant and always being brought into the foreground. I already quoted to you Philippa Foot saying that he's the best source for understanding Aristotle. Many of these contributions can be useful to many people who study and use them with discernment. Thomas sought, secondly, to develop a comprehensive world and life view. While some may disagree with features of his system, no one before him and few since him have developed a worldview as complete as his. And it should be said that Hegel, G.W.F. Hegel, is the last great systematician, but his system does not come anywhere as close to Thomas. So Thomas provides us with a worldview that is very comprehensive, and it's very compelling. Third, Aquinas met the major intellectual challenges to the Christianity of his age on their own ground. So he dealt with the Muslim philosophers, and he dealt with what they were doing with Aristotle, and then he gave a Christian response to them. Differences will arise over the exact way in which he answered that challenge. People may disagree with what he said with regard for instance, the Mass and transubstantiation. But contemporary Christians can applaud his refusal to take refuge in pietism, just being spiritual and praying and that sort of thing, as opposed to engaging culture. Pietism is kind of famous for removing itself from culture. Fideism, just being a God said it, I believe it, that settles it kind of guy, or a rationalism. He didn't do any of that, but he actually engaged his world and was a compelling witness and defender, for and defender of Christianity. And that ends that last little lecture.